Good morning. Welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. We are doing another tutorial. It's been a minute for me, so if I feel or seem like I haven't done this in a little while, there you go. It's been a minute, but we are back with a tutorial, and I am here in my randomizer zoo, and this one I've shown off on the channel before occasionally. This is a Tufalik Tier Park. Basically means like accidental animal park or random park or whatever. I have been working on this one for several months now. It's kind of been my on and off project in the background, and I've put a lot of love into it, and I want to talk about how I've managed to get this far, stuck with it, but more specifically in how I've gotten to the point where I am with the detailing, and where I've found the ideas in order to continue to work on this without burning myself out, because burnout is really something that unfortunately Planet Zoo maps are very susceptible to, at least in my experience. Now, this is a big zoo, so I'm going to be constantly getting notifications. I'm going to try my best to ignore them. But as far as, like, how have we gotten to the point where, this is my new entrance. I originally started over there. We moved to the spawn points over here. That's pretty simple to do. Deciding on themes and then decorating and then building up all the different parts and pieces. And there's still a lot of stuff where I think that this could be improved. But I'm coming to those conclusions after letting things rest for, in my case, several months in a lot of cases. So I want to talk about how I start refining and detailing. A lot of this game is getting your initial idea down on paper, and then after that, I think that it's very easy to decide that things are good enough. We don't need to revisit anything. And unfortunately, this like I said, it can lead to a lot of burnout because you're constantly executing a lot of very big ideas, but you're not necessarily ever building up the skill or the eye for detail. You're not revisiting and checking your work and seeing how you've grown. And I think that seeing those kinds of progress can be a huge space of motivation. So today I want to talk about how to not only revisit, but think about, what's worth revisiting, what's worth putting your energy into, and how you're going to continue ideas or rework ideas that you had previously. So in this case, I am actually looking at this habitat over here. So this is going to be a mixed habitat for my Red River hogs and my hippos. And these are full-sized hippos, not the pygmy ones. So I've done a few things already. The main thing that I'm looking at is going to be the foliage. So there we go. I'm not sure why there's lag. I'm really hoping that my computer's okay. I've had to move it a lot. But the foliage is sort of a constant argument. As I'm sure a lot of people know, you have this limited coverage range that each animal thinks that it wants, and it doesn't reflect reality. In reality, every animal, save for like the really desert ones, should have they shouldn't have a coverage tolerance because the world is covered in plants. Really what we're talking about here is moving space and how much coverage of the plants you can reasonably use before you're going to run into traversal problems. And that's really why this coverage bar is here. So one of the things that I'm looking at is, incompatible plants versus compatible plants, and how am I arranging them. So I originally had a whole bunch of papyrus grass that was bordering on all of these waterways. And the main issue that I ran into is that papyrus is not traversable for most animals. It's considered an opaque block, despite the fact that it looks like it should be traversable. And this is just one of those quirks of the game. But in a previous project, I ended up working on basically a sudlands. And that video may or may not ever make it to the channel, I don't know. But I took a lot of inspiration from the suds out in Africa and made these pads here. So these are fully traversable, this particular version. There are some issues with the plants. I originally had more papyrus and more bushes, but those limited traversability. Like, this entire thing was locked off, so I ended up removing those until I got to the plants that all the animals could traverse. So now there's some layering issues that we do need to work on, but we want to keep some of this height, some of this texture. So that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to fix about this model. And then after that, we're going to remove all the water from this, and we're going to redo this habitat, and we're going to use these sudland pieces. Because while we need traversable ground space, really what the animals need is space to walk. So as long as they have a walking requirement that's met, you don't necessarily have to have terrain. It's one of the really nice things. So we're going to work on redoing this today. And then after that, I want to move over and focus more on out of habitat decoration, because like we focus a lot on what's inside the habitat, and that is good, but sometimes you need space between habitats in order to let the zoo rest, and that's something that I've been really working on practicing. It's been slow going, and it's often a little bit difficult, but it does pay off in a big way. So if I can give an example, if we come over here, I have this area right through here, and this is not actually part of any habitat. This is actually a wall between habitats. I'm going to go into explore mode. Whoop. There we go. That's properly explore mode. Wanted to hide the UI. So this little waterway right here, kind of swampy, very well grown out, is actually a wall between the caribou and the rest of the habitat. So partially it's just a nice little viewing area. You can see the caribou before you get up into the actual, like, viewing zones. If you look through here, you can just get a glimpse of the caribou right there. All of this area is not designated as part of the habitat, but it is serving a purpose. It's setting the atmosphere. And building outside of your habitats gives you the freedom to just go hog wild. You don't have to worry about, over expending on your coverage rates, and you can think about mixing plants from different zones, different, parts of the world without it inconveniencing any of your animals. And it also just gives space for your guests to rest. Now at least I don't treat my guests like real humans. I don't bother. They're just not. They're very much simulation creatures. However, a part of the fun of building a zoo in Planet Zoo is to consider, like, what would a real life human want? And in real life, guests need downtime. They need a space to rest where they're not constantly looking at something new and exciting. And so part of the way that we can do this is to create areas that are well decorated, but there's no animals present. It's just for your guests to wander through. This helps to break up the zoo. It can help for establishing different areas of your park. And then it also just helps with atmosphere, which is a big thing. So this whole area through here, there's no animals to look at. There are animals over here, and then if we go back down, there's an animal over here, actually over here. And then if we go this way, there's an animal over here. But this whole area that we're walking through is just for the sake of having traversable space. And I actually need to move this right here. This is actually an errant object that I don't need to be... Actually need this to be in my collection of bits and bobs, which is right over here right now. There we are. So we're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about dead spaces between habitats, and we're going to talk about redecorating habitats. So this will be the third iteration that I've taken this through. The original one was just a big empty paddock. After I came through and completely rebuilt my park from the ground up, I ended up settling on this. However, yeah, it just makes more sense for us to go ahead and rethink about this. So let's go ahead and look at what our animals are doing. So I've got my elderly hippos. I'm expecting that I'm probably going to have to get a new herd soon. I do have this adult, and I do have some juveniles, and they're eventually going to grow up. But for right now, that's something that I'm looking at is having to rebuy some of the hippos. When we look at their terrain constraints, we can see that we're meeting them under the current herd size. So there's a little bit of snow in the habitat. Unfortunately, that's kind of unavoidable on this map. We don't have sand, but they have a great tolerance for it. They require rock and soil, which we're just barely meeting their needs. We have a lot of short grass, and we have a lot of long grass. So one of the things that we want to do is make sure that they have the right mixture of all these different terrain requirements but we also want to add splashes of greenery. So terrain is going to basically be reserved for things like our soil, rock, and sand, and anything green we're going to use those sud pads for. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and fix some of the texturing on them, and then after that, we're going to empty out this water basin, and we will talk about refinishing this habitat. Okay, so I have taken that pad and I've completely ripped it down, and part of what I did was I took all the foliage off, I moved it to the side, and then I took just this block of moss, I'm going to move it over here, and I stripped out any of the excess pieces that I didn't need. Because of the fact that these moss blocks, both the champion moss and the plain moss, count as foliage, we want to make sure that we're reducing the amount of redundancy that we have. This is partially going to be for our part count. So if you're here from like console A, normally we focus on computer, and I don't have any experience with console, but hopefully some of this is useful for you. Welcome to the community. B, there's a certain threshold for which if you have things too dense and too complex, it doesn't bother the animals, but it will bother your computer. And so because I'm already getting to a pretty big zoo, and I know that there's a lot of detailing that I want to do, part of what we need to explore is min-maxing. So even though I can use a ton of rocks and have a ton of redundancy, if my goal is to just make a covering like this, then I don't need all of that redundancy, so I can reduce the amount of build parts. So that's what I've done here. The other thing that I did was I made sure to make this as flat as I possibly could. Hippos do not like variation in their terrain whatsoever, and so this makes making rock work, including stuff like moss, very difficult because of the fact that you need it to be as smooth as possible. So in this case, that's basically what I've done here, is I've tried to reduce the amount of terrain variation, and then after that, I took all of the plants and I moved them so that way they now align to my moss pad. And you'll notice that I'm not completely covering the edges, I'm focusing on sort of the center. And this is because as we build up these pads, we're going to want more connection points. Basically points of overlap where the textures are going to mesh together. And so we care more about what's in the center because that's where things are going to be left open versus the edges where we can sort of mask ourselves. And this is the amount of redundancy that I was left with, because when I made the suds, I was doing it in creative mode, and I didn't need to worry about, most of my animals' welfare needs, and so I was allowed to have these redundancies. In a franchise zoo, you kind of want to be careful with that. There's going to be a certain amount of frustration that you're going to cause your animals when you decide to overfoliage, which we are going to do. Partially because I just want this to finally look good, and partially because a lot of the plants that we're including in here, like the Yorkshire foggrass and the pig face, are not native to Africa, and so they're going to cause frustrations for the animal. We want to try and keep those as much to a minimum, but in this case it's only like a 2 or 3 point cost to their overall welfare, so I'm less concerned about it, especially since the rest of our welfare is pretty good. I can up their nutrition, I can always up their enrichment, and so this is a place where we can sort of cut into their welfare budget, as it were, and it's going to be okay, especially because we're already doing so. Those points are already subtracted. So now that I've got this piece, this is going to be my template, I'm going to go ahead and move it back over to where I don't have to think about it too much, because next thing is that we need to go ahead and remove all the water. And when this happens, it is going to throw all of our hippos into a panic. So we're kind of left with two options. The first is to move all of the animals back into the trade center, which, depending on what your trade center looks like, may or may not be less nightmarish. I've got 60 animals in here out of my 200 allotment. So when I move my animals into the trade center, it's going to give me the opportunity to sort through and figure out who I need to keep, who I need to rehome. But it's also going to bloat my trade center. So if you're one of those people who's already pushing the line, you may want to just work around them. So I'm going to go ahead and move mine to the trade center real quick. And then after that, it will give us the freedom that we need to be able to edit this without causing any sort of issues. So the door for this habitat is over here. It looks like this is going to be my best way to grab it. So I'm going to select all of my animals, move to the trade center, and then I'm going to go back up here swap to my Red River hogs, do the same thing. And now we're going to get, whoop! And there should be nothing in the habitat. So, on the one hand, this is going to piss off my guests. They're going to say, where did all the animals go? I can't see anything, and they're going to use this just as the walkway. Honestly, for right now, that's fine. Let's go ahead and get our water removed. And we want to be conscious of this height, because this was a pretty good height for all of my animals. But we can also use a few more advanced techniques in order to smooth this out. So I think the first thing I want to do... Oh, let's go ahead and get rid of the water over here as well. And thankfully, I've separated off where my alligators and crocodiles are over here, so they're not going to be affected. This is another part of water management, is making sure that all of your sections are separated. You don't want to throw down a large section of water and then just throw a border through it, because the border is going to cause issues with animals recognizing that it is one. It's a whole issue. Thankfully, just by separating out your bodies of water, you create redundancies where the animals recognize each individual volume. So, next thing we're going to do is we're going to move all of our plants, and we're not going to delete them. We're just going to move them. Again, we're in franchise right now, so we have a budget. And so I need to respect that budget. Even though I've got $1 million, it is possible to create, you know, a multi-$1,000 habitat and cause yourself some problems. On top of that, there's just not a lot of sense in buying redundancies if you don't need to. So this helps us conserve our parts. Next thing, let's go ahead and move our shelters, because those are probably going to get moved to new locations. And lastly, enrichment. Okay, now I'm pretty sure that I've gotten everything, but now I'm going to go into explore mode and I'm going to walk this area. I'm not going to walk the whole thing, but I do want to look at it in first-person point of view, partially because this is going to give me an idea of what the animals are dealing with, partially for the keepers, and so that way I kind of understand, like, what is the general space that we're working with? What do we need to keep? What is the intentionality here? So especially when you're working over the span of like months and years, you can kind of run into a problem where like you don't remember what your original intention was, or that your original intention no longer works for a space, or never did in the first place, and you've just been creating workarounds. In my case, what I wanted to do was I wanted to have this massive bridge through here. And I wanted it to be sort of a walkway so that way the people could experience these animals. Now, you'll notice that there is an immediate problem. Because of the way that I've designed this bridge, each of these guests has a certain radius, and depending on how large your habitat is, there's going to be a threshold where they can no longer see your animal. So, if I remember correctly, here in Habitat, we have this predicted area visibility. Now this is not as useful as it was in, like, Zoo Tycoon 2, where it would show a cone, like a bubble, of where the guests could view. But this is giving us an idea of, like, what is visible, right? So we're viewing Habitat 10. If we go ahead and select it, in theory, all of this is yellow. In reality, not so much. So, here we go. So, predicted animal visibility. We have this walkway, and everything up here is kind of a light blue. So if the animal is within this walkway, they can see it. You'll notice that most of the habitat, not really. Part of this is because we removed animals, but even so, in practice, their visibility comes out to about this line right here. And after that, they can't see anything. So I've added in these little bubbles in order to compensate, and they have worked, but these have a very limited threshold and not everybody uses them. So if we're going to have this crosswalk between this area and this area, we need to make sure that they can actually view the animals. The other thing is that I have all of this space over here that, because of my zoo layout, is inaccessible. Guests would need to walk all the way up here, and then I'd have to build a path that goes all the way around in order to get to this space, when I could just have a stretch that goes right here. So how do I want to consider the expansion of my zoo in the future, and what is it doing for me right now? These are the two things that I'm thinking about. So I'm going to do something big and drastic, and maybe a little bit excessive. I'm going to delete my paths. Now there's a couple of ways that we can do this. So if we care about our guest numbers, which right now I have a cap that says no more than 2,500 for the sake of my computer, that's the limit that my computer can hold. If I don't care and I want to get rid of the guests through here, I can just delete this pathway. And it's nice, it's quick, it's simple. But the next thing that I can do is I can use the fact that there are no animals, and I can turn all of this into a staff path, and now it tells people, hey, get out of my path at your earliest convenience. So it gives time for the AI to process, and it says, you need to go. You need to leave. So for right now, I'm going to leave this one open to the public. Let me get my ice path again. And then I'm going to come over to here to these stations. I'm going to come to my dome network. And you see how it says facility has power? If we cut power to these, it'll tell people to get out. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to go back to my home station. And I'm going to cut the power. And now everybody is going to relocate. So now our last guests have basically left. There they go. And our maintenance man is making his way to the next job. So to make sure that I don't have any more maintenance people come through, I'm going to go ahead and delete that path. And then once he gets off of it, I'm going to delete this path. And now I've isolated this section. Now I'm going to come over to my bulldozer. And thankfully we have a whole bunch of options to say, hey, I do or don't want whatever. You just make sure. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the only thing that I'm deleting is path extras. I don't want construction or nature. We don't want paths either. Those are going to be pretty simple to clear out. That's it. That's all I want. And now I'm going to come through here, and it's going to auto-delete all of these items, which is such a blessing. I remember before we had this, and it was a nightmare. It was awful. Like, you had to come through and select every single one of them individually, because since they counted as individual facilities, you couldn't mass select them. It was terrible. So this is a huge lifesaver. I'm going to take all of my education speakers, and honestly, they're not a big cost, so I'm just going to delete them. And now we can clear out the path. So now you can see my exposed security cameras. Again, these are not that big of an expenditure. These in particular are only like 10 bucks. It's the tall ones that you have to watch out for. But as I've talked about before, and I believe my staff tutorial video, security is not reliant on one particular staff member, it's a system. And so when you are putting in your security cameras in order to make your security guard effective, you're allowed to hide them. You don't actually have to expose them to the world. You can hide them under paths, which is what I did here. So now that we've got this completely undone, got this completely reworked, I am going to keep my heaters in simply because I want to make sure that I can rearrange them and heat this area as necessary. The only problem, of course, is going to be that when we do our terrain modifications, we're going to have to keep an eye on them, and we're going to need to move them. Arguably, we could just delete the whole lot, and maybe that is the sensible direction to go, but it is going to take time for this whole area to warm up no matter what we do. This way, at least, we can see our terrain. So now, everybody's cleared out of here. These little guest entrances, these domes are closed. So I'm going to go ahead and remove them because I would like some underwater viewing. Okay, so now that we've gotten rid of our path, we're now free to move it wherever we want. We can decide to have a split path. We can have it on the ground, in the air, however we need to. What are fixed staples, however, are going to be these habitat barriers. They're not really something that I can change except for over here where I can expand. And then this whole castle situation needs to stay. So from here, we're free to rework anything we want. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to take out my terrain tool and I'm going to level this entire place. Yes, we want to make sure of these heights, but really what we're looking at is a 1 meter. I just need to keep in my head that this is a 1 meter. Next thing that we're looking at is because these waterways through here and through here are going to be anchor points. It's going to be important that I remember that the sources are there and that I follow through in our new habitat design. So now we're going to completely level this out. Right here I have this waterfall. I don't want to move it, but it is a great note. In case this needs to take multiple days, this little water source right here is a great way for us to mark that, hey, this is our height level. Alright, and then the last thing that I want to do is, because we're going to rearrange all of our terrain type ratios, I'm going to go ahead and turn this to something neutral that I know that our hippos are not going to have a problem with. So in this case, I'm going to use something like heavy soil. Maybe light soil. I'm thinking light soil. So we're going to paint everything with this light soil because we know that they're going to need it. And because we know that if things remain with light soil, it's not going to cost us, you know. So now we have our blank canvas. We can kind of see where the old height map was based off of our little heaters, and that's okay. The main thing is we don't want to bury them. We want these to be accessible. We can also now see where our cold spots are going to be. So the reason why I go through all of this effort is because I want to create for myself as close to a blank canvas as I possibly can. This means that I'm not relying on anything that I have done previously unless there is something specific that I know that I want to keep. So in that case, I would keep the specific features that I know that I want around. For example, I want this waterfall. I don't necessarily want this terrain meshing that we've got going on through here, so I will just go ahead and smooth this out a little bit. And I think that that looks a lot nicer. But now, because we can't see what we had on the terrain, we can't form any biases, right? And that's going to be another big thing, is that, again, if there's something that you don't want to keep, then there's no reason for it to reflect in your new work, you know? So now that we've got what's essentially a big old white piece of paper, now we can start to decide where are we going to have our reed pads, and then figure out where our water space needs to go off of that. Now again, we do need to preserve land space, but we also need to make sure that we have enough water space, so there's got to be a balance. So with our reed pad, and with our stasis coverings over here, or not stasis coverings, hard shelter, that's the word I'm looking for, we can start to figure out where we want our hard shelter to be, where we want these different focal points. And then after that, we can start to think about how we're going to insulate our guests from these dangerous animals. We can also decide whether or not we even want this particular shelter. Now, I'm not going to lie, it's pretty ugly. It looks terrible. This is something that I threw together out of necessity because my animals were not getting enough hard shelter, not because I like it or because it fits the theme of the area that we're in. So this is another case where we start to talk about biases, right? We're talking about hippos, we think the tropics, we want to incorporate tropic aspects into, you know, whatever we're building. Are tropic assets necessarily what we need? We have a little bit of it through here, you know, with these little thatch roofs. But does thatch roof make sense in this area? It's kind of, I mean, there's precedent for both, you know. Maybe we want something a bit thicker. We don't want this thin bamboo, or thin thatch. We want the thick thatch that normally comes with our Africa stuff. Perhaps we don't want it at all. We know that we're going to need some kind of slope just so that way we can get the snow off, but maybe we want higher roofs. And of course this does present us with a fourth option, which is that we make a dedicated combination of hard shelter and viewing space. This allows our guests to get really up and close with the hippos, but it also protects them and gives us an option for something thematic. Quite frankly, I like that idea. We have a lot of space through here, and our guests, no matter what, they're going to have to take a long walk through here, and they're going to have to take a long walk through here. So something to break that up, giving them something to see, is going to help. Especially because of the fact that we're going to have to think about walling sections of this off away from the guests in order to keep them safe. Alrighty, so we've had some minor changes I'm going to go over. First things first, I've started on my connector ways. So I know that I'm going to need some kind of path to get into this habitat from 3 different points. From over here, which is going to be the path that leads back to the main entrance. From over here, which is going to lead us past the bonobos. And I want a new third entrance somewhere over here. And I've put down some placeholder path, which is a little bit hard to see because of the snow. It goes right here, and then it connects up into this little experiment that I was working on. So let me explain this experiment, because I grew up with, like, Busch Gardens and, like, the Disney Animal Adventure Park. So a lot of the times when I come into a game like this, where I have infinite creativity, I tend to think a lot about what a zoo can be, not what a zoo is. So you've probably seen from the fact that, I do a lot of fantasy builds, I do a lot of city builds, I put animals in places where animals don't go. A lot of that is because I think about, where can an animal theoretically be, as opposed to, like, what you're gonna see at your local zoo. And this is very much already a fantasy park. We're building out of an old castle, there's a lot of biome variation, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And for the most part, we've kept everything kind of flat. But because of the fact that we have terrain variation through here, it's going to come down into what's essentially an artificial wetlands, and it's already artificially warm. We're already working with a lot of infrastructure that is, quite frankly, ridiculous in a tundra scenario like this. All of that to say, because we have a large area with animals that arguably require even more space than what we've given them, and we're about to subtract a significant amount of space because of how we need these paths to hook together, and the fact that we're going to have a new hard shelter for them, our options are kind of limited. We have to expand. How are we going to expand? Now, the obvious answer is to just take my, flattened terrain brush and to just keep moving the edges outward. But that's not good for the layout of my zoo, right? This habitat, now that it's flat and you can see it, takes up a good 1/8 of our footprint. It's an enormous space. And this is something that other people have also run into with, like, elephants and polar bears and, all of our giant megafauna. We're always going to run into these issues. And so, like I've shown off in polar bear habitats before, we really have 2 options. We can keep going out, which is not good for the layout of our zoo, especially because our hippos really don't like to be with anything else. They're basically friends with Red River hogs and nothing else, and in real life they get violent. So our next option is to play with height. Do you see why I prefaced it with what a zoo can be now? Because hippos don't like height. So how do we get them to like height? These are the opportunities that we have once you have your constraints. And we have pretty definitive constraints now. So, what I'm thinking is that what we actually do is we have 2 different pathways. We have an upper level and we have a lower level. So we need to think about how much under-level space we need, how are our guests getting there, and how are our hippos getting there. Because unfortunately, in a better timeline, we would have animal elevators in this game, but this isn't that better timeline. So let's go ahead, and I think I'm actually going to do this with my terrain stamp tool. So I'm going to go ahead and go into subtract, and I want to make sure that I've got a pretty good depth to it. We want this to be pretty deep, because of the fact that we know that there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to have to cram down there. So let's go ahead and figure out how deep we're allowed to make this. That's a pretty good depth. That's a very good depth. So we're buying ourselves 17 meters. thereabouts. We can probably go up to 20 meters. And at a certain point, this is going to be a little bit too deep, but remember, we need a lot of height in order to move our hippos. But the deeper that we make our height, the more room that we're going to need them in order to get down. So these are sort of the balancing acts that we're going to be playing with. I'm going to keep this hole, and then I'm going to use my flatten to foundation tool, and I'm going to figure out where a good height is for us to be able to move these animals up and down. And we need to keep in mind that we're going to have water underneath here. So if we know that we don't want, let's say that we want from here up to be solid ground. So this gives us this whole space to work with. So let's see where we can go with this. I've currently got it set to 5. So now let's go ahead and push up, and let's see how tall of a roof we can give this. And if we ever lose track, we can always go into our construction pieces and we can get a generic wall like this. I think that 8 meters of height is probably going to be good. And that it still gives us a good amount of clearance. So this is probably fine. If we consider this to be our water level, and then we know that we have, what is that, about a meter to work with up and down? I think that that's probably okay, and we still have room here for support. We want to make sure that we have this space. So I think right now we're fine. We can go ahead and remove this. Let's go ahead and fill in this hole now that we know that we don't need this depth. So for now, I'm going to excavate this entire area. I'm going to figure out where my lower level needs to start and end, and then after that, we will talk about repairing the upper area. So I'm going to go ahead and get this shape done, and then after that, I'll show you how we're going to connect everything up. Hi, we've hopped zoos. Don't worry about it. This is how things go. You've been here. It's okay. It's fine. We are in a completely different zoo looking at a tiger habitat that I worked on a little while ago, and part of what I want to show you is this overhang situation that I've made. Now, yes, the entire habitat is a ride. Again, Busch Gardens. But what I want to show you is this idea, right? So we have this giant crevasse, and we have these overhangs that are covered in all these different vines that give this area a highly, like, it's got a lot of terrain variation to it. It's interesting, you know. So this is the kind of thing that we're going to be drawing on, that we're going to replicate from. So these vines, the wisteria, the overhangs, and so I'm going through and I'm making blueprints. So I've got this little triangle thing, which is not my best one, simply because it's got a little bit of greebling that I didn't mean for it to have. This is going to be my better one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these as blueprints, and then I'll show you what we're going to do with them. I mean, this is a big hint, but, you know. We'll bring them into the map. Okay, the world is right again. We're back where we're supposed to be. So I've got my blueprint. I'm going to go ahead and pull that out just for me to have. And now I've got all my little bits and bobs. So this is like a striation chunk. This is really nice for when you want to have that kind of sheetrock look. But you don't necessarily want to have to layer all the bits and bobs together again. I've got our little tundra pieces over here, and then I've got our tropical pieces over here, which, considering that we're using a lot of both in this area, actually works out great for me. It means that I don't have to make these triangle pieces again. So, what are we doing? Because this huge pit is untenable. So I've tested the water level, so I've got this 1 meter little block right here just to make sure that everything's going to work okay. It is. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to figure out a layout. So again, we want this surface level to still be traversable. We're going to have to fill this back in. We know that we're going to have water coming down this direction, and it makes sense for it to flow down into here. And then over in this direction, it makes sense for this little waterfall to continue down this way, and for us to have kind of like a river walk path. And so to that end, I've made, outside of this hook, I've got the path laid out of where I want it to go, but this is still going to be placeholder. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we can get our people down into this area, and we need to make sure that we can get our hippos down there as well. So let's go ahead, remove the water, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to get our hippos down here. So thankfully we can go back to our terrain stamp tool and we can use these ramps. And this is going to help us figure out where we need to build our path. So as long as we keep this nice and smooth, we should be okay. And I have it at the maximum length, and we can't really do much more than that. So while the ramp is not necessarily useful on its own, what we can do is we can use this flattened surface. And we can find a relatively smooth spot, maybe like right there. Because unfortunately these ramps are not smooth. So this allows us to connect back up with the terrain. And now we have the start of a little entrance, right? So as long as we keep this in mind, we should be all right. The next question, of course, is, do we want it here? So where are we going to have the most land for them to get in and out of? This is probably the most ideal, but I think I would like to maybe scoot it over a little bit, and you'll see why in a minute. Okay, so now we have the ramp for our hippos. So let's go ahead and talk about the ramp for our humans, because this is gonna be a mess. The reason why I have this little tower over here is to figure out whether or not I can use the curves on our staircases, on our paths, in order to be able to make basically a circle walkway, a spiral downstairs. I don't know what you call that. So the answer is a resounding not well at all. So instead, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take from this theming that I've already got over here, I'm going to use straight ramps, and I'm going to use my right angle curves in order to get people down. So this gives us our dimensions. It tells us where we can and cannot go. So let's go ahead and get out our facilities, or not our facilities, our construction. Let's go ahead and get out a floor. And we know that this is going to be our walkway. Let's also get out our curved walls, so that way we can make sure that we're getting all of our stuff in the right spot. So with that done, let's go ahead and pull out our water table again. Now we can take this object and we can set it where we want it to go. So there's probably fine. Let's go ahead and grab a path. We're going to do align to grid. We're going to pull from grid 17. I'm going to turn off railing on elevated. And we can see that it's being obstructed by the water volume because it's sitting underneath where our little stone bits are. So I thought that might happen. That's why we check. Let's raise it up a little bit more. And we can always lower the building, but it's very difficult to move the paths once you have them down. So now our path is going to sit just above the water, right where we want it to be. Now, it's going to tell us that it's obstructed by the volume no matter what. This is because underneath the path there's going to be a barrier where it demands an air volume, but we can override that quite easily. So as long as we have this in the position where we want it on our height, now we can alter it to fit where we want it to be for getting the path down here. I'm thinking right there is going to be just fine. So now we'll get rid of our water and we'll go ahead and start on our pathing. So because all of this is already buffered with our staff paths, we don't have to worry about anybody getting in here, so we can just use the paths that we actually want to use. In my case, I'm going to use these wooden ones because I've already used them throughout the park. Deselect grid, and I'm going to make sure that I've got my angle snap turned on. Oh, and I've got a little bit of... There we are. Deselect. And now we're going to come over here. I'm going to make sure that my curve slopes are off. And I'm going to take this as high as I can get it. Now every time that we go up, we can only move 2 meters. So now we're mostly at ground level. And at this point, I think we can just keep going straight up. Now we're going to go back over to our path. We're going to find a good place for this to connect to. So I think that's probably good. Gives us this little overhang here. If anything, I kind of want it to be attached like... Yeah, I think that's probably as good as it's going to get. So now we can work on pulling our path over here. And we're going to get this little jagged edge. Now this is actually pretty easy to solve. We're going to remove one of our staircases. We're going to bring it back closer. We're going to reduce our elevated length. And that's just about perfect. And I think that that's going to work just fine for our purposes. So now we need to take this structure, and we need to create a similar one over on this side, but it doesn't have to remain within the habitat. That's the nice bit. Since everything is so crammed up over here, there's just no reasonable space without also removing visibility to our penguins. So this is going to work fine, but then once we get over here, there's just no reason to have such a large unit take up even more of a footprint. So let's go ahead and go back into our align to grid. Again, we're going to pull from our group, not from our paths, because otherwise we're going to run into alignment issues. And now we can do flatten to terrain and tunneling. And this gives us a nice, easy way to build our walkway back over here. Let's go ahead and establish how wide we want this area to be. So for example, all of this is going to be dead space, but if we move into this direction, we're going to be cutting off area for the hippos. So let's go ahead and widen it back here. And because this is such a massive area, I'm actually going to use this for concessions. So let's go ahead. Let's trace where these are going to be. We're going to deselect from path, or from grid, and this way we can tell where we're landing. So we're going to end up roughly over here. This is probably enough space, so let's go ahead and start climbing upwards. Make sure that we remove our elevated length meter. Alrighty, that is finally done. Now, of course, none of this stuff is going to stay here, but it's good enough for our notes, and that's really what I think is going to matter here. So, now that we have this entire space, we know that we're going to put a whole bunch of stuff down here. We will get there, but first, I want to make sure that we have all of the other pieces of the footprint laid out. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to be able to deal with the water situation. So we have this obstruction. There we are. Oh, because it's putting it down there. Thankfully, the easiest way that we're going to be able to deal with this is to simply use glass barriers. So we will start by figuring out where we can put them. Right here is probably just fine. Let's not, yeah, there we go. 1 meter is more than enough for now, and we can adjust it later. And now let's just go ahead and lay this glass. So now that we've got this tucked into the wall, let's go ahead and check our water layer. This is still considered obstructed, so we will go ahead and grab our barrier that we've now made, and let's raise the height. Now you need 2 meters of height in order to make sure that the water has somewhere to go. And that's going to be just fine for us. So while this water is not going to stay, I am going to keep it for now, just so that way we have it. And then we're going to work on this upper layer now. So let's go ahead and figure out where we want our flat terrain to be. So I know that I want kind of a crevasse. We know that this area has to remain open. Let's go ahead and grab this. And we're just going to make sure that this starts to make sense over here. And I think that that's probably a good shape. Now, we know from experimentation that this height is going to be more than enough for the hippos to get across here. But in case we run into issues with width or decoration where this gets narrowed off, we're also going to do a couple of little tricks in order to make sure that they actually have full walking space. We're going to check our depth. And I think that this is probably going to be enough for both our ceiling and the thickness that we need in order to maintain the water. But now we're going to go over to flatten to terrace. We're going to make sure that we have our shallow pool offset, and we're going to set our terrace height to 1. And now we can start to fill in where we want our upper level of water to be. So I know that I want this to be sort of a marshy boardwalk area, so I'm going to play into that. But I'm not going to bring it so far that it dips into this space where we need to make sure that the hippos can get to for them to get down. Same thing on this side. Now we're going to have plenty of water. That's not going to be an issue. What we need to make sure that we have is enough land space. Well, I think we can bring it just up to like maybe this edge right here, because I think it would be really cool to have water pouring into the bottom down here, kind of like a waterfall. Let's go ahead and test our water tables. So we have these two areas, and then I'm going to leave this one open. So all of this under here now counts as hard shelter. So this sort of leaves us with an option. We can redesign these or reuse them and put little shelters above us on this upper floor, or alternatively, we can decide to just not do that, have all of this space be open greenery, and then down here just let this be our shelter. So we have a lot of good options here. I think that we will leave our shelters until we know a little bit more of what we're looking at. We're getting to a point now where we're going to need to bring the hippos back in order for us to start measuring what our traversability is. So let us double check everything before we get the hippos in. I think that this space right here we can probably fill. And we need to make sure that we're preserving height through here. So one of the things that I think we're going to do is we're going to reduce the intensity on our push, and then we're just going to open this up a little bit. And if it's a little thinner, that's okay. So long as we're not obstructing any of our water volumes, it won't matter too much. There we are. So that should be tall enough. And let's go ahead and fill in some of this. Now I think that's going to be a little bit too wide. That's a little bit better. We can always remove it later using our flatten to surface. Make sure that we grab somewhere where we know that the surface is relatively flat. And of course we can always use our push to move in the sides. 40% is going to be a little bit too slow. And this way, if we decide that we want to use rocks instead, it's not going to be to their detriment. I think that's probably fine for now. Let's smooth this out. Now, because we've altered the terrain so much, there is something that we need to consider. Planet Zoo has height limitations for how deep it will calculate a habitat, but these are not broadcast to the player. So, when we add these hippos in, we need to make sure that this doesn't constitute as an escape. This is normally a problem if you have underground areas that breach the edge of an existing above-ground habitat, but we just want to be sure that we don't have any issues with this. So now that we've basically got our new floor plan figured out, let's go ahead and bring our hippos in and make sure that we've actually increased their traversable area and have not boxed them in. So this is our largest hippo. He's our, well, he shouldn't be breeding, but I think he might be. Let's go ahead and bring him back in. Especially when you have issues where like clearances really matter, like we have in our little bridge area. It is generally best to bring in the largest male animal you have, because then you know that the maximum hitbox size is being calculated for and everything else will fit. This also really matters when you deal with crocodilians, because the males are so obnoxiously large. It's actually one of Planet Zoo's rare, like, inaccuracies. Male crocodilians are generally smaller than the females. And this holds true through most of the reptile world, unless there's like some data that I'm seriously missing. And it's because larger females can hold larger clutch sizes for their eggs, and so that's considered like an interest point, I guess, for determining mates. And so the females end up getting larger and larger and larger, whereas the males just don't have that same pressure. The opposite is true for mammals, like our hippo, who's just arrived. So let's go ahead and grab out our traversable area so we can see that he can get down into this space, which is exactly what we want. He's looking around, and we can now figure out like where everything's going to be. So let's go ahead and grab a glass barrier since we know that everything's going to be calculated for, and let's go ahead and shore this up because we know that we want this to be a waterfall. That should be fine. Let's make sure that we don't have any spillover. Everything's looking okay so far. And now let's recalculate traversable space. Good. So now we have his traversable space. We can see that he can move basically everywhere in his habitat, including the areas that we filled in with water. That's exactly what we want. So now let's go ahead and figure out what our population is going to be. So we don't want male overlap. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hippos. And of our 7, 3 are going to be juveniles. So we have a land requirement of 3263 and a water requirement of 3263 as well. So based on the numbers that we have roughly 2,000 meters on each end in order to work with. This is exactly what we want because we want this to be decorated. So that means that we're going to end up reducing their traversability space by quite a lot. So now that we have everything built in, I am going to go through the tedious bit of rearranging all of the heaters so that way this space ends up being the right temperature for our hippos. Okay, so all of our heaters have been rearranged. We don't have anything else floating really. So I am happy with this. So now we get to make this place look beautiful. So there's 2 places where we can start. One of them is that we go ahead and just paint the terrain now, and the other one is that we start on our rock work. So I think that in order for us to have a good idea of what we need where, I'm going to go ahead and do the rock work first. Or sorry, I'm going to go ahead and do the terrain painting first, and then after that, we will start adding in our rock work so that way we can blend everything. So we know that we need a little bit of grass, long and short, but it's not mandatory, and we know that we need rock. Thankfully, rock is going to be something that's a blender, so we're not too worried about that. Let's go ahead and make sure that we have our short grasses and our long grasses in where we want them. This upper level is now looking a lot better. Let's go ahead and get our rock in where we know that rock is supposed to be. It's a pretty good start. And let's blend with some sand, since we have the budget for it. There. So now we know that we still don't have quite enough rock, but a lot of it is going to be along these walls, so we can go ahead and paint these in. And already we've gotten rid of a lot of that, I don't know what I'm looking at, but it's sort of ugly kind of look. At the very least, it's something a little bit more sightly. So, I think I'm also going to blend my smooth rock in with my dirt, especially down here. That looks just a little bit better. And now we can start on our actual structural rocks. So this is going to be the highlight for the new crevasse. I like it. I think it works okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to... Not really smooth. Smooth, I mean, we're going to use the smooth tool. But a lot of what we're going to do is a lot of low intensity pulling. Probably maybe 60%. Just so that way all of these edges match up. Ideally what we want is a nice clean break between these 2 heights. There we are, and now we will go underneath and we will clean this whole mess up. Alright, and now we will recalculate. So the hippos are able to walk onto the edge of our ledges, which is what we want. Everything so far is looking pretty good. I'm very happy with this. So, now we can go ahead and start to fix our water features. I'm just gonna bring you back in for that. You've seen people make waterfalls. Or you haven't, and I assure you there's lots of people out there who make waterfalls. Mine are not exactly spectacular, so we're going to fix that. Have a little bit of the water coming down through here. Fix this. And then after that we will talk about decorating. Okay, so got all the waterfalls in, did a little bit more rock work off screen. Wasn't very interesting. It was a lot of copy paste, and then I did this little bit through here, and then we'll focus specifically on these waterways. But I just wanted to finish this up now that we know that this is going to be a definitive border. So let's go ahead and talk about these little. Let's go ahead and talk about these little walkways. So we have our hippo here, and I'm trying to work quickly because otherwise he's going to get hungry, and that's not what I want. So they have a little bit of difficulty moving around bumps. So like through here on this waterfall, he can get up to the edge, but he can't get near these rocks. And so this is something that we're going to have to be careful of as we do this, because I've got these little rocks through here as well, and they look cool, but obviously he can't traverse them. So there's only so much that we're going to be able to do in terms of rock work. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this because for as funky as the lighting is, it's fixing to be nighttime and then you're not going to be able to see anything. So I know the lighting is a little bit harsh right now, but it is kind of what it is, and we have to work quickly. So, I'm thinking that really the best thing that we can do here is occasionally use mulch, and then we're going to focus on our plants. So we worked on our little pad of plant life up here in the beginning. Now is the time that we use this. So we're just going to find points where it makes sense to incorporate. And then we're going to use it basically as if we had made something between like a patch of grass or like a piece of rock work or something like that. And then that way we can sort of blend all this stuff in. And so long as we keep spinning it and keep randomizing it, it's not going to look too weird. So something like that. And I don't think I'm going to use much more up on this surface area, but underneath, I do want to use a little bit of this. Let's go ahead and do something like this for up here, and then we will call it good. And then let's check his threshold, because we might be at it. Yeah, we definitely are. So this is kind of the maximum of what he's going to tolerate. Again, we're going to push into this because I want this to be nicely decorated, and he's going to be fine no matter what. We've kind of already done the damage that we're going to do. So down through here is where we're going to start incorporating some of these paths as well. Something like that. Along this waterfall space might be really pretty. And I think maybe another one that just sort of goes... how do we want to do this? Like that? Looks pretty good. Yeah, and then maybe around this side. So that's giving it this nice swampy vibe. I think that'll be good. There's a lot of rock work and stuff that I'm going to need to do under here. I will probably do that off camera. What I want to focus on are some of the details that we can really hammer out for now. So we do want a little bit of some more bushes and things like that. But for now, let's go ahead and work with what we already have. So for example, this fever tree, how weird is it going to be if we put it under here? Actually, it looks quite good. From above, it looks very strange. We do have this smaller fever tree. Yeah, that looks alright. And then this larger one, where do we want you? Maybe like up over here. That could be interesting. And then our dome palms. Yeah, that'll be cool. And then you kind of walk past them on your way. I think this fever tree might be small enough that we can fit it in here. Maybe towards the back? That might be interesting. Like that? That actually looks pretty cool. It doesn't look like a tree anymore, but I don't think it needs to be one. And then we have these short little plants right here, these water bananas. And I think that these belong near the walkway. Yeah, just like that. Okay, and now, next thing we need to do, let's clean up our terrain a little bit just through here. Haven't used a lot of sand, so let's use some of that. There we are. And now, I think what we're gonna do is get, I have these deer and grass. Here we are. So I love these little deer and grass pads. They let me do like a ton of really vibrant fill-in very quickly. And I use them for basically all of my African animals, so they fit really nicely into wherever I'm going to put them. And if you do them in these nice, interesting shapes, you can kind of hook them around stuff, you can connect everything together, and it doesn't look like you're quite repeating the same texture over and over again. It's really handy. And maybe we'll just mix in a little bit through here. We'll keep it nice and short. So that looks nice and lush. Underneath here, is there anything else we really want to do? Not really. I think it can remain mostly water. We don't want to take up more than we have to with our water space. We have already taken up a lot. And then the rock work and the vines, once we come through and do all that, that's going to look the best, I think. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this little area through here, and I am actually going to skip my recording it because we're going to run a little bit long if I don't start skipping pieces that you've seen a million times before. Okay, so I've got this little bit done, and it doesn't look like much because, quite frankly, I ran into a different problem. It looks fine. It looks good. I walked around along it, and it seems okay. But one of the problems that we were running into is that we have this plants coverage, and we have our regular coverage, and no matter what, things are looking pretty dire. Part of it is that in order to get this splash of color through here, we have to use non-native plants, so this is going to be mostly the buffalo grass that's taking up a lot of it, and the coastal pigface, as well as the Yorkshire grass. So this is where we're kind of running into several problems. We also have a few, like, tundra items, and that's because they're in this little alcove right here. Because of the way that I ended up having to set up the barrier, as you can see through here, we've got just this little bit of awkwardness in order to get our domes to work. So the other... not the other. Basically, the thing that was contributing the most to this was the moss, the champion moss. So I got these worked out. Basically, the hippos couldn't get up onto them, and so I worked out a way for them to basically traverse it. Realized that the champion moss was causing me more problems than it was worth, and so I completely removed that and ended up redoing the bases of these so that way they can actually walk on them with the tropical, like, mossy rocks. So let's see if they can still walk on this. That's going to be kind of a question. So they can get up onto this one. They can't get up onto this one. This particular spot has caused me a lot of problems. But these two over here, they're okay because they're not trying to get up out of the water. So I'll have to work on that a little bit. And the hippo is starting to get pretty hungry. So there are some enrichment things we need to go deal with. And one of my gems boxes trying to inbreed, which is Ayula. Hi, there you are. Yes, get me out of the camera. Thank you. Trying to interbreed with who? You? Okay. I'm just gonna move you to the trade center. I think that's probably the easiest. There we go. Especially since she's a gold rated, we'll probably want to keep her for the next generation. So that's dealt with. The hippo is having a charge because somebody put a watermelon in here for him. Lovely. Can you get to it? You're acting like you can eat it. Well, you're no longer hungry. So I guess I missed one, but thank goodness. Alright. So aside from dealing with the problems with that little pad over there, I think we've basically maxed out our greenery. We really cannot shove anything else in here. So that being the case, I think it's time for us to go ahead and start adding in our guest facility items. So, first things first, let's get our railing. Yeah, and we'll deal with that in a little while. And then this staircase I'm going to keep open. Now let's go back into our original base piece. And the ground, these little tiles, they're not going to matter too much, but they're mostly there so that way we have the alignment. So that's going to be okay. Let's copy this section. Start building this up. I think that level's just fine. I don't think we need anything more than that. And then we will work on repairing the terrain around here in just a moment. That's not going to be too hard. We can do it with rocks. For now, however, I'm going to go ahead, get this insulated, start building on this little area down here, and I will bring you back for that because right now it's going to be just a lot of these dry pieces and some glass. It's not going to be anything thrilling. Okay, well, it's not the most impressive thing I've ever built, but, I mean, it's in, and it separates the wall. So we've got a little bit of food through here, we've got the full walkway, and I would take you up the stairs, but I can't, because unfortunately they still haven't fixed the bugs that are associated with the stairs when you're in first-person mode. So it's fine. I ended up just going with the path supports. I know that they're not the prettiest, but they take up the least amount of space, and quite frankly at this point that's kind of what I care about. So I think now the only thing left to do is to get our animals back in. Okay, let's go grab our enrichment. Let's see here, where do we want the food trough? Probably where the guests can see, right? Right here seems probably the best spot for it. And then we'll do another one over here. Grab our enrichment items. I'm just gonna put them in the sky. Not where they belong, but I'm not concerned yet. Small barrel feeder can go over here. I think the waterfall should go downstairs. And then lastly, our sprinklers. And these can go downstairs. And that should be all of their enrichment. So everything should be fine now. We just need to make sure that we have enough of everything. Looks like we could use some more food enrichment for the area. I'm thinking maybe another melon. This hanging barrel might be okay over here. That's plenty. And now, are the hogs in yet? I don't think they are. Our army of caretakers. Yeah, they've got their interspecies bonus, they've got plenty of enrichment, and now, since the hogs are in, we need to check and see where they can go. So, looks like they're going to be able to traverse this entire walkway. How are they getting up onto it? It looks like just right here. So we should be able to just block this off with something. Probably a rock. Rocks are usually good for this kind of thing. So now they stay off the path. That's what we want. And how do they fare over here? Looks like everything is traversable for them. So if that's going to be the case, I'm not going to try and fiddle with these pads anymore. They can just be quiet areas for the hogs. And because we're kind of... Our population is slowly starting to die out, I have gone ahead and adopted a few more. So I'm just waiting for them. Looks like 1, 2, and you should be the last one. Mumina. And 3. So now all of you can come to this habitat. And I think honestly I'm gonna be done. There are a few other things that I need to do. I need to add in like the bins and the benches and the donation boxes because we deleted all of those last time. But at this point it's just finishing up a whole bunch of habitat stuff. You know, all the really basic stuff that everybody knows that they should be doing, right guys? Yeah. You guys know. Y'all know. So I think with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and grab a little bit of B-reel and yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed this, that it's been helpful. You know, it's a lot of taking the space that you already have, finding the things that you want to keep, finding the things that you think really need to go away, and sometimes being willing to break some game rules. You know, with these guys, I know we're supposed to do our best for keeping their welfare as high as we can, but I mean, they're at 95. They're fine. They're doing great, so. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy some of the walkthrough, and I'll see you next time.